Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wicked Problems. I'm your host, Toby Corbliss, and today I'm going to be speaking to David K. Hurst. David is a speaker, writer, and management educator who has extensive experience both as a practicing manager and as a teacher. Having worked for 25 years in what he describes as a number of train wrecks, based on what I'm sure would be familiar, rigid organizational change practices that we often encounter in traditional businesses, David found himself working at a North American industrial distributor, which had sales of over $1 billion Canadian dollars and employed something like 1,600 people. However, through various factors, the business found itself on the brink of collapse. And David worked with his fellow senior execs to save the company and restructure it. And in doing so, had to abandon some of those rigid organizational change principles and really learn a whole load of different skills and techniques and ideas. And he describes that as being transformative, changed his entire life, completely changed his career. He's a fascinating individual. We, as you know, on this show, run an episode for about half an hour, give or take. I have to tell you, we stayed on for over an hour afterwards, and it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So I'm really hoping that David will agree to come back and do another episode at some point. However, it's a great episode that we have for you. Unusually for Wicked Problems, we have a presentation, which is very interesting. David takes us through some of his ideas, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. He talks about the adaptive eco cycle, and he presents it in a really fascinating way. So please enjoy this episode, and I will see you soon. Take care. David, welcome to Wicked Problems. It's really, really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming along. I'm very keen on hearing your experience and also about the adaptive cycle. I wonder if you could just give a little intro yourself, set the context and the scene for the people watching and listening.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Toby. Really very pleased to be here. Well, the story begins about 40 years ago now, when I was working for an industrial company, distributor of steel, actually, very prosaic product. And we were taken over in a vastly over-leveraged buyout, where we ended up borrowing so much money from the bank, it was not just our problem, it was also their problem. And for the next 4 years, we discovered a completely different approach to management. It was like going through the looking glass. Everything that we had known before turned out to be inadequate, and we discovered kind of the opposites. We were very hierarchical. We were forced to scrap the hierarchy, essentially, or at least put it into the deep background. And we set up cross-functional teams. The place became a lot more egalitarian. We were brilliant in solving some very wicked problems because, frankly, this sort of thing had not been encountered before. Every organization and every situation is, to a certain extent, quite unique. And yet we survived. And in the process, discovered this, what I call an ecological adaptive approach to management. The two things I was looking to explain was, first of all, the role of crisis in change. I had worked for a number of organizations, and whenever I joined them, they seemed to get into trouble. When I was young, I thought it was me. But as I grew older, I realized that the linear technical approach I'd learned at business school was quite inadequate. It was an abstraction that wasn't very helpful. And so the role of crisis in change, and when you look around, it certainly happens politically and then socially, it is an important factor. The second thing was the sort of figure ground relationship between hierarchy and teams. I say we scrapped the hierarchy, but we really didn't. It went into deep background, and this egalitarian method of organizing came to the fore. But it didn't stay there. There were some situations where you had to evoke what we came to call hierarchy on demand, where you had to revert to the hierarchy because the teams needed help and they needed hierarchical help. So this doesn't say that you have to banish command, but you have to understand the role of command and when it is appropriate and when it is not. And of course, it's overused far too much currently. So those were the two things I had to understand: was the role of crisis in change and this figure ground relationship between hierarchy and an egalitarian flat organization.
I'm smiling because I think much of this is going to be very, very familiar to people out there, right? It's something, the things you're talking about, things people come across all the time. So.
Okay. Well, what I would like to do is, if I may, is run through a short, about a 10-minute presentation, just taking through, going through some of the frameworks I developed over these 40 years, because it was a life-changing experience for me. I've always been a closet academic, I guess, and this really shook up everything I thought I knew about management and so on. So I'd like to take you through that and then come back together at the end and talk about the implications, if I may.
Let's do that. Perfect.
Okay, here we go. The key discovery was something called the adaptive cycle, developed by a Canadian ecologist, Buzz Holling is his name. And he studied ecosystems, forests, as well as estuaries and all other kinds of ecosystems. And he noticed that they go through what he called an adaptive cycle. The adaptive cycle starts with birth, growth, maturity, decline, and then decline followed by a crisis, a destruction of some kind. In this case, fire, but it could be drought and pestilence. It turns out that this is nature's way. She renews herself through crisis. So I had found systems that needed crisis to change, but to change to be sustainable, because the fire is followed by a faster back loop of release of the nutrients into the environment, reorganization, and rebirth. And so around and around we go. Long processes of growth and maturity on the front, rapid processes of destruction and renewal on the back. And as soon as I saw this, I said, this is our story. And indeed, very intimate connections between this cycle and the cycle, the shape of stories. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If this reminds you of a Taoist process, then you're absolutely right. I think because a Taoist process, it's an early ecological view of the world. Two processes, one creative, the other destructive, each of which contains within it the seeds of the other. And it leads to an interesting view on change, because it says nothing lasts unless it is incessantly renewed. Stability and change are entangled with each other. It's not either one or the other, it's both and in this complex ecological relationship. So let me tell you a story to put some flesh on these bones. A human enterprise, what would it look like through this ecological lens? Well, three things to take into account. The secret of our success is our ability to cooperate in groups much larger than the family. That really is the distinctive human capability. And there are three great catalysts that promote that cooperation. Integration, do this to belong. exchange, do this for me and I'll do this for you, the market, if you like, and threat, do this or else, which we're very familiar with in large-scale organizations. Passion, reason, power is what I call them for short. So let's tell the story. It's long, slow processes of growth on the front, rapid processes of destruction on the back, and our three areas: passion, innovators, reason, managers and leaders, and power is all about administrators. Innovators, free to act, don't know what to do. We could all be in business for ourselves tomorrow. What would we do? We'll be guided by our passions and those of our community. In the middle, free to act, know what to do. This is what they teach in the business schools, where you have this wonderful place that is all about reason. And on the far right, know what to do, not free to act, the situation in which many of us find ourselves trying to generate change in organizations. We know what to do, but we just can't do it. We're constrained. So here we go with the story. Community of practice and trust, that's where new enterprises are conceived in passion. It's a process of entrepreneurship. Henry Mintzberg calls it bricolage, and we have here a Silicon Valley network and a process of improvisation. Make a little, sell a little, make a little more. Oh, maybe we have to pivot, but I feel a strategy coming on, emergent strategy. Now, most enterprises or would-be enterprises fail at this stage. They're still born. But the few lucky survivors enter the stage that the business schools know and love, called strategic management. And Michael Porter's value chain appears, not from the left brain of the CEO, I should emphasize, but by rationalization of what's working. And the organization is growing in scale, and the only way to manage scale is through a process of abstraction. You put things into categories, and you don't deal with individuals anymore, you deal with classes. And so it's a useful abstraction. That's what a map is. And it's growing like crazy, and the business is doing wonderfully well. And so you install an organization to preserve this recipe you've discovered. And here we go. The conservation stage, we're very familiar with this stable organization. It is our conventional bureaucracy. Boss, 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 another boss on top. And of course, the big boss comes sailing in to depress, compress, oppress the people underneath. But it's been done for the very best of reasons, which is to preserve this recipe for success. I mean, it's obvious that's what you have to do. In the process, though, of course, they will undoubtedly build head office. And it's a wonderful place with the princes and the towers. And if you wanted a resource when you were in the entrepreneurial phase, you had to find a customer. But now you've got to get into the palace to somebody who's got budget, and there's courtiers selling access. And meanwhile, the map is dating because the territory is not stable. It's continually changing. The landscape moves over time. And you can see what this does. It sets us up for a crisis. Fire in the palace. And it kicks us into the back loop of the eco-cycle. And the back loop is, frankly, the human dimension, the moral dimension. You can see the headings, and the pictures are taken from one of the oldest stories in the Hebrew scriptures. The first image is of confusion in the wilderness, a place you can wander, you can die. 40 years you can spend in the wilderness. I think General Motors spent 40 years there before going bankrupt. To come out of the wilderness, creative or adaptive leadership to take you up the mountain to get a vision of community, promised land, resources for young people, milk, honey. And this is where choice comes from. And choice is the opposite of crisis, because now you have options. Crisis, you have no choice. And this back loop, if the front loop is about a map and abstractions, the back loop is about getting on the ground and finding a way using a compass based on your experience, frankly, a moral compass, if you like. That's what gives us guidance in great times of trouble.
Mm.
And I should mention that Holling and his associates have taken this much further. They've taken it into a multi-tier, in this case, only 3 levels, but I call them micro, macro, and the meso in the middle. And you can see they go at different speeds. And the notion is that the small, fast processes disrupt those above them, potentially, and the big, slow processes constrain those beneath them. And so you have an ecological balance, a continual tension between disruption and constraint. And you can see the 4 processes in there: emergence, growth, constraint, and destruction. And now, and this is a big jump, we can take my eco cycle, the human application of this, and put it in the same context. And here's just an example, because what I found is that this framework is actually a great container of frameworks. So here in the middle, at the middle level, I have a more elaborate eco cycle, and into it, I've dropped a 2x2 matrix. In this case, it's from Christensen and Marx and Stevenson and their tools of cooperation and change. Above it, I've got Geoffrey Moore's work from Dealing with Darwin. He says basically at the industry level, we have a continual alternation going between complex businesses and volume businesses, between integrated offerings and modular offerings. And this is an alternation we see in many industries. And then down below in the small, fast disruption, of course, I've got the product life cycle. In this case, you could put a technology cycle in there. And these are the fast variables changing, the technology that underpins your organization that's in the middle. So, ecological implications for managers: lead like a gardener, not like an engineer. Select for potential, manage for emergence. You can't make people grow. All you can do is choose them and can create the conditions in which they can grow. Which leads to my last slide, essentially a summary of what I consider as this ecological approach to wicked problems. We're looking at a dual systems perspective. On the front loop, the engineering technical loop, we have analytical thinking. That's what they teach in the business schools. And frankly, it's the only thing you can teach in the classroom. On the back loop is that grounded analogical inquiry, getting to the real phenomena and asking yourself, what is this like? Using metaphors and analogies. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to you and stop my share to talk about some of these things.
That was fascinating, truly, truly fascinating. So your Mobius strip there that you've got, where you've got that analytical thinking coming up, and you showed a slide there where you overlaid, well, it's not overlaid, but you said it could act as a container for other frameworks, other models, let's say.
That's right. Exactly that. If you think of the eco cycle, I mean, just think of the passion, reason, power as the 3 catalysts for cooperation. This triad is found all over in sociology. In my book, The New Ecology of Leadership, which I guess I should mention, I supply a matrix of about 6 or 7 different takes on this triad. So you can play with those. There's 2x2 matrices you can drop in. Fits people who use the DISC matrix at the personal level. It fits in beautifully. Dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. It fits in beautifully. So you can actually use this as a way of dropping is like that gadget that if you go to the optician, they make you look through, and it's got all the dials and wheels. It's actually called a phoropter, which is not very well known. But this is like that. It can act as that kind of lens where you can drop in a lens and say, okay, let's put in Michael Porter's value chain. What does it do for us? If you don't like it, pull it out. Put in another. Put in Larry Griner's.
Griner's the one that jumped out at me when we were going through it just then. It's into my mind.
Yeah, that's right. You can drop Larry Griner's revolution and evolution as organizations grow, and you can drop it then, and that gives you a finer grain take on where are we, because the whole thing is you can only start from where you're at, but understanding where you're at is absolutely critical. It's not easy. And this, I believe, helps one understand, where am I at? If Michael Porter's value chain doesn't help, pull it out, drop in Larry Griner's crises, and ask yourself, does this resonate with our experience in any way? And so you don't get stuck. I mean, one of the enormous problems I have is certainly teaching, because I'm actually not a consultant, because I'm not a consultant. I'm an educator, and in teaching, I can't get people to get away from SWOT analysis. They cling to SWOT analysis as if it was a scripture. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that it allows them to preserve the current power structure. And throughout this theme is that mainstream analytical management tries to keep everything rational, because they really don't want to deal with power in the mainstream. And I think getting people to change lenses, implicitly at least, carries the same threat, that they're worried that it might come up with something that says the problem is us, which it usually is, of course, the current structure.
Well, because structures become more brittle over time, and that eventually that brittleness will break, right? And so it's that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. And of course, this is where the role of crisis comes in, and the fact that nature everywhere uses fire, wind, drought, pestilence as an opportunity to change, the current power structure. Because in a mature forest, the big trees hog the resources. They take the sun, they take the rain. I'm talking temperate forest here. Tropical forests are slightly different, but it's the same dynamic on a much faster clock speed. But the resource, they hog the resources. The hierarchy, it's choked with hierarchy in a mature temperate forest, and so you need something to clear the space, to recycle the nutrients and create, sort of like some giant gardener creating the patch in which new stuff can grow, the conditions in which new stuff can grow.
I also thought you overlaid, in part of your presentation, you overlaid the Taoist image, right? Which is also represented as, you can think of it as it creating order from chaos, right? And the chaos and the order have to be somehow in balance, right? We can't. I think, for me, I'm thinking of Heraclitus, who basically said, you never step in the same river twice, i.e., change is the only constant. Things are always changing, and if you stand still, it will change around you, and therefore your context has changed. And if you don't understand that, you will become the brittle thing and the thing that breaks.
Absolutely. This is thoroughly Heraclitean, whereas mainstream management is all about Parmenides. And this is a long attention going back through history. And of course, you can see these things throughout our history. You can talk about Apollo and Dionysus if you like, but the notion is this double perspective, that they're entangled with each other. I mean, it's William Blake, right? Yes. Double my vision. Yeah. All these echoes go right throughout our cultural history.
Well, the master and his emissary, I think, is another useful vision, perhaps.
I'm a fan of Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, if you know it at all.
That's the one I was meaning, yeah.
Sorry, yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm also interested. You talked about Mintzberg and his bricolage, and of course, you also talk about emergent strategy, which is very Mintzberg, right? It's
absolutely,
as opposed to the idea that you can create a strategy and then you all just follow some kind of plan, and then that'll make sure that everything works out. In fact, the reality, because you've got this emergent world, this brittle world, this change, this crisis, this chaos and order from chaos kind of theory, actually you have no choice but to follow emergent strategy at some level.
Eventually, it takes time for people. The system is perfect at some stage, the hierarchical structure, just after you've embedded this recipe for success. But then it ages, and the speed is going to vary greatly. So you've got industries in different clock speeds, and it comes suddenly. And of course, politically, I think this has huge implications. So I'm not a political scientist, but I suspect at the political level, one could argue that we are also in the right-hand power trap in many parts of the Western world at the moment. And so, yes, so it's always both and, but you see the going to the left, and there's no accident that the left is emergence and the right is established, is that it questions the power structure. Because it must, because that's the problem. It's being held, the organization is being held too steady. And the question is how do you combine the both and of the enough flexibility to generate the kinds of innovation you need, and enough rigidity to exploit the success of the ones that work. And the balance will vary from organization to organization. And it is, I think, one of the critical roles of leadership in this whole process is and Henry's not a huge fan of the separation, but I think it's useful to think of this leadership, creative leadership going up the mountain, and strategic management, creating the structure. That says, we don't need to go up the mountain. I can see the universe from my corner office. It's at both ends that you're trying to discover.
What I wonder, I know you've looked at Agile, which is obviously very popular these days. It's been around for some 20 odd years now. And one of the things I've seen happening is people creating models or frameworks around Agile. So there are these different frameworks that exist. Pick your own favorite. But what then happens is they get reified into a structure, the framework solidifies, and then it's sold as gospel. And in fact, what seems to then happen is that brittleization, if that's even a word, but that rigidity or rigidification of what was a very flexible thing. It's like you can see it happening, and therefore you can see it coming, that has to be, it's almost creating a rigidity in the market, almost selling itself as an adaptivity, which I find quite fascinating. It's like,
this is deeply embedded in the culture. Take this pill to lose weight, no exercise or diet required. In other words, you don't have to change, but you can make change. You can manipulate the system in some way so that it changes in a desired way, but you don't have to change. You are outside it. And this, of course, is the great power of abstraction, is that there's a wonderful book by John Lewis Gaddis called The Landscape of History, and he talks about the power of the person on top of the mountain who can see everything laid out underneath them. And it's a feeling of omnipotence almost, that you are above the clouds, that you are masters of the universe, if you will. And this is the problem, is that Agile and indeed design thinking are sold on the basis of follow these steps and all will be well. You don't have to change. All you have to do is just follow these steps. And frankly, the folks in organizations, this is not their first rodeo. they've seen it all before, and it breeds huge cynicism. Here they come with another head office initiative, and it gets worse as you go, because there's more and more of these, and there's no genuine change in the power structure, and that's the challenge of dealing with an incumbent management group. Unless you have someone like a Satya Nadella of Microsoft. And he's done some wonderful things, but people tend to focus on what he's done rather than what it took to put him in the position where he could do those things. Because what he's doing is, we know that, we know what it is. Break it up, small teams, egalitarian, get the nudges and tweaks right, scrap the executive parking, all that stuff we can do, but we don't have the power. Nadella got the power. That's the problem, is understanding how the power structure changed in Microsoft. So a person like Nadella could come to the top and be able to do what, frankly, not anybody can do this as well. But that's the issue. It's not what he did, it's how he got in the position to be able to do it.
That in itself a fascinating topic, I think. The adaptive cycle is very powerful. I think it looks, looks, reading up on it, seeing your presentation there, very powerful. And it feels to me like, you can drop your other models in there. It helps maybe contextualize those models as well, right? So it's not.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you look at something like Kotter's 8-step change theory, and it's clearly a top-down approach to change, and he has modified it in some ways, but its popularity is because it is the 8 steps, and all you need to do is create a sense of urgency, whatever that means. But it's how that urgency emerges is absolutely critical. Is it a pandemic, or is it another edict from the corner office? Makes a big difference. The how is much more. The what's so obvious. The how is particular.
Very good. And look, if people wanted to find out more about the work that you do, about the adaptive cycle, where would you point them towards? Where could they go to find out more?
Well, of course, there is my website, www.davidkhurst.com. Don't leave out the K, because you'll end up in the wrong place. And there's a huge amount of material embedded in the blogs and the writings there. I mean, I've been at this for 40 years. The other thing is that I sent you the Lead Like a Gardener Medium article, which also has a YouTube presentation, which is a bit different from the one I've done, but very close to it. And that's on Medium. I have lots of stuff on LinkedIn. Please come and say hi. And of course, I have the book, The New Ecology of Leadership. It's 2012 from Columbia University Press. And prior to that, my very first book, Crisis and Renewal, which came out of Harvard Business School. And that was the original one, and the role of crisis and change, and introduced the eco-cycle.
So I will make sure that links are provided. So if you're watching this, you should find links under this video. Please do visit David's website. It is fascinating, and watch the YouTube video that's on there. It is also very, very interesting. I think it's got a lot of validity in the current world situations that we find ourselves in, and that various people in various organizations, particularly now, you talked about, the micro, the meso, and the macro invocations. I think at the micro level, if you think about how technology is changing so quickly these days, that's spinning faster and faster and faster. And maybe there's even smaller sub-levels under that. Who knows? One for people to ponder. David, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. We never have enough time on these things. I'm hoping that maybe you'll come back someday and give us a bit more insight. Thank you.
Toby, thank you so much for having me. It's just been a delight, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.